Mastery of non-mastery is what Roland Barthes described as an ethic, a guide to life lived through twinklings of tact in an anecdotal discourse recruited to outsmart mastery. This involves much by way of experiment and failure. Enmeshed in previous happenings, this book began as a hybrid object, part theater script, left-hand page, and part commentary on the script, right-hand page. But the script resisted the distinction between theater and commentary, make-believe and belief, wind and words. Such is the mastery of non-mastery, what Roland Barthes in his last lecture course on the neutral described as an ethic, a guide to life lived through twinklings of tact in an anecdotal discourse recruited to outsmart mastery. But doesn't outsmarting mastery perpetuate mastery, if only in another form? This is what leads Barthes to say that the neutral refuses to dogmatize, because the exposition of the non-dogmatic cannot itself be dogmatic. This poses problems of exposition. Barthes' twinkling of tact resembles Nietzsche's tuning fork, which, touching the idols of culture, echoes their hollowness, thereby destroying them. In this case, the tuning fork is predicated on the notion that mastery is a matter of guile, of foxes as well as of lions, what Hubert Murray, a colonial governor in Papua in the early 20th century, called administration by bluff. Mastery very much included looking the part. Shaven, clean white duds, pith helmet, and all that. How else could a few hundred white men hold sway over hundreds of thousands of natives? But then there was that pesky anthropologist, Bronislaw Manilowski, whom the governor deemed a German pederast, and who did not seem to care much for bluff. Not that sort, at least. He wore pajamas or oversized shorts that kept falling as he took photographs of the islanders, who called him not a German pederast, but the guy with loose shorts. Who knows what that did to administration by bluff? He had another nickname as well, show-off, or performer. Performer he certainly was, but aren't we all? As when toward the end of his fieldwork he was photographed by his friend Billy the Pearler, decked out in colonizing regalia, pith helmet and whited and white trousers and a flowing long-sleeve whited and white shirt, he mimicked the white man as ethnographer in a series of tableaux vivants, artfully staged to show off his interaction with the islanders, male and female. In one tableau he sits on a log with a bunch of almost naked men, fondling a long spatula inserted into a bulbous gourd on his lap containing lime for betel nut. They could be a bunch of high school boys playing with their dicks. In another, he seems to be airborne, floating above the islanders. He could be a spook, a spirit. In still another, he assiduously examines necklaces strewn over the naked bosom of a young woman. He seems very clinical, like a physical anthropologist or an evaluator from Christie's. Then there is the pose to end all poses with him tautly erect, hands aggressively on hips, gazing at a scantily clad sorcerer, so the caption says, who leans languidly against a palm tree, staring back at him. The erotic tension is unmistakable. Labeled Introduction to the Ethnographer, the tableaux seem not merely theatrical, but a spoof of ethnography and its colonial entailment. We could call them Sly Dog Postcards from the Field, 1917. But contrast that with other Sly Dog tricks in the published monograph, Argonauts of the Western Pacific, where Malinowski would have us believe he's blessedly alone on a desert island, but for the natives, as the ship that brought him sails over the horizon. In fact, the island had its district officer, Bellamy, a medical student from Cambridge University, a long jetty and a prison for those natives who resisted Bellamy's reform. But Malinowski, as much as we, his readers and anthropologists writing their own ethnographies, seem to need and enjoy such fictions. Being alone on an island with nobody but the natives. Similar tricks of the trade appear throughout Argonauts of the Western Pacific. He writes vividly, for example, of a Kula expedition giving the impression of being together with Trobrianders on board their canoes, when in fact the Trobrianders forced him to follow behind, because he affected the wind. That is another kind of performance. The one affecting the wind, no less than the sleight of hand affecting the illusion of authorial presence. You get the point? If you need a thief to catch a thief, then you'd do well to have a performer in pajamas or whiter-than-white kit to catch out a colonial governor. What Antonio Gramsci called hegemony can take only so much derisive humor. It was Murray's nightmare come true. His bluff was bluffed. But what more could you expect of a German pederast? Really? In a similar vein, in 1937, Bertolt Brecht asked who rules in the Third Reich. Fear rules, he replied. Including the fear the masters feel, that one fine day the multitude will disobey, yawn, and not even bother to look up. The brown shirts fear the man whose arm doesn't fly up, and are terrified of the man who wishes them a good morning. Driven by anxiety, they break into homes and search the lavatories, and it is anxiety that makes them burn whole libraries. Thus, fear rules not only those who are ruled, but the rulers too. What Brecht's alienation effect achieves in this poem is to turn mastery against itself. And something more. Something that has always made Brecht's theatre and poetry resonate with strategic ambiguity, doubling guile back onto itself. Given this trick, whereby tuning forks become hammers, it is small wonder that the poem ends up by invoking a magical spell. The House of Tar, the Assyrian, that mighty fortress, which according to legend could not be taken by any army, but when one single distinct word was spoken inside it, fell to dust. The greatest trick of all here is poetic conceit. We suspend disbelief. We assimilate the fairy tale of the one magic word as counterweight to the Third Reich's administration by bluff. So strange this evocation of magic by a Marxist poet. It's really not his style, is it? But then, has he not pulled off something grand? First, he turns the tables, asking us to reverse the gaze and dwell not on the fear felt by the citizenry, but by the fear felt by the masters. Such a simple step, but revelatory. Second, the resort to magic serves as if to mimetically match the magic sustaining fascism, which, like the fortress, is best tackled not from outside but from within. This strategy fits well with what, 7 years after Brecht's poem was written, the authors of Dialectic of Enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno, who detested Brecht, also in reference to the Third Reich called the organization of mimesis. By this, they referred in a very general sort of way to the hypnotic trance evoked in everyday slogans and rites, as well as in the spectacular theatric staged in Nuremberg. See Leni Riefenstahl's film The Triumph of the Will. The point, as I see it, being the fascist welding of the mass into the body politic by means of mimetic connectivity, and the sense of primitivism entailed in those rites, in that trance, and in mimicism itself. In which case we could say that mastery of non-mastery, MNM, is the disorganization of the organization of mimesis, with the masked dancer winding his way through the audience, come what may. If, along the lines of Brecht's poem, we were to think of the Third Reich's fascism as a modernization of sympathetic magic, then the disorganization of its organization would be the work of counter-sorcery. Perhaps along the lines Artaud set forth in To Be Done with the Judgment of God, a censored 1947 radio broadcast in which language was transformed into screams and babble of a private, secret, sacred language confronting what Artaud understood to be our bewitched cosmos.
J'ai appris hier. Il faut croire que je m'attarde. Peut-être n'est-ce qu'un faux bruit, l'un de ces sales ragots.
But there's also that MNM, that mastery of non-mastery, silence left, reverberating after Artaud's cries and rough-edged growl die away, leaving silence like John Cage's piano composition, without a sound, confounding expectations while noise from the streets, or from inside your head fills the void, and the abdominal muscle clench for the dancer's next twist. A man of twists and turns, says Homer about Odysseus, that master of guile who stuffs his oarsmen's ears with wax, so they will not hear the Sirens' song, while he is bound to the mast. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno interpret this tale as exemplary of the cunning required for domination, and the costs it imposes both on slaves and on the master. The oarsman cannot hear the beauty of the song. The master has his senses partitioned. He can hear, but he cannot move in response to what he is hearing. He is still bound. His senses are dislocated. No longer is he a unified sensory motor apparatus. The music and its beauty become detached, autonomous entities. But in true Eminem style, Kafka comments that Homer got it wrong. What actually happened is that the Sirens, whose song can penetrate anything, stopped singing. They did this because silence was their greatest weapon. Or perhaps because they were overcome by the bliss on Odysseus' face, so pleased was he with his guile in outsmarting them. He had, says Kafka, actually stuffed his own ears with wax, not realizing that the song of the Sirens can penetrate anything. Hence he did not hear their silence, their greatest weapon. And before we can ask how can you not hear silence, Kafka adds that Odysseus was so full of guile, was such a fox, that it is possible he was faking it, that his smiling at his own cleverness was itself an act, held up to the Sirens and the gods as a sort of shield. No wonder Kafka adds here that here human understanding is beyond its depths. Is that what the mastery of non-mastery is then? Beyond the depths of human understanding? An unwinding of unwinding without end? Do twinklings of tact, alienation effects, and incessant contradiction involve at their core a mirroring, a mimesis that turns vertiginously in on itself? This Eminem weave of doing and outdoing is highlighted by Nietzsche's unsettling question as to why we consider truth more important than deception. His point being that truth itself cannot be truthfully justified, and that without the idea of truth there can be no deception, which he takes to be the lifeblood of existence. For you only have to ask yourself carefully, why do you not want to deceive? Especially if it should seem, and it does seem, as if life aimed at semblance, meaning error, deception, simulation, delusion, self-delusion, and when the great sweep of life has actually always shown itself to be on the side of the most unscrupulous swindlers. Thus affirms the scholar of antiquity, son and grandson of Lutheran pastors on both his mother's and his father's side. And if life aims at semblance and dissimulation, is that not magnified today with the surveillance state and Facebook, not to mention the machinations of Kremlin and White House? The very instrument with which you tap out messages day and night, your laptop computer, is in fact the wooden horse of Troy, only smaller and smarter. What then of Walter Benjamin's mimetic faculty, also aimed at semblance? As all that is solid melts into wild mimesis along with wild weather, the sorts of mimesis Flaubert describes in the Temptations of Saint Anthony? Through the eyes of the saint tempted by the devil, the great imitator, he describes a world given over to mimetic relays, plants no longer distinct from animals, insects identical to rose petals. Other plants are like stones, and stones are like brains as stalactites become breasts. This hermit's world has been the subject of famous paintings from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance to Max Ernst and Salvador Dalí. But Flaubert's rendering, stimulated by the painting of Bruegel the Younger that he saw in the Balbi collection in Genoa, is more than visual and more than tactile. The saint wants to become what he sees. I feel like flying, he says, swimming, yelping, bellowing, howling. He wants to be inside everything, to drift away with odors, flow like water, vibrate like sound, gleam like light, and curl myself into every shape, to penetrate each atom, to get down to the depth of matter, to be matter. This fits the mimetic bill beautifully. Or horrendously. Take your pick. I refer to the twofold character of mimesis. First, as visual imitation, as with a vision or photograph. And second, as bodily engagement, as with using a lover's hair or undergarment to magically draw nigh. Only here with the saint, the phrase bodily engagement seems far too feeble. The saint is mad, for sure, afflicted with the savage ecstasies of religion and being alone in his cave but for his visions. His mimesis are also mad. But does not our world today have as much religious and magical resonance as that of the AD 3rd century hermit in the Egyptian desert? For is not nature today enchanted, or rather re-enchanted? Is this not obvious, as our negative sacred sun burns us to a crisp, as nature turns more surreal each day with ominous green-yellow vistas and bluer than blue skies, while the snow falls one day, rising the next as mist, stripping us naked as pixies as the cosmos draws close? The closest rendering of this new world of ours is the Temptation of St. Anthony triptych painted by Hieronymus Bosch between 1520 and 1530. While commentaries abound, I would point to the mix of fusion and rupture of hybrid forms made of animals, fish, birds, humans and plants, enveloping and dismembering each other often in extraordinarily sexualized maneuvers. Is this then the metamorphic sublime? Bruegel the Younger's rendition of the saint is dark and moody. The emphasis is on the strange light rather than on the diminutive creatures that, like goblins or pet animals, surround the saint. The light is that of magic hour torn apart, as it were, by cosmic trauma. The saint is but a tiny figure, crouched over a large book that absorbs all his attention. A large wooden dwelling forms much of the background. It is not only on the verge of collapsing, but is merging with the nature around it, with a massive boulder and a twisted fossil-like tree. It is easy today to read this as the collapse of the human-made world, flecked by a modern sky. Our desert today is not the Egyptian one, famously home to European magics. Ours is fulsome in the depth space of planetary demise, to which the bodily unconscious reacts furiously. Stabilize an unstable world, leaving traces and tremors in consciousness, as this book you hold in your hands of traces and tremors. If it be, as all manner of conditions, mimesis and metamorphoses sublime are aroused, such as grains and stones, not this time around. Mimetic excess, meaning mimesis doubling back on itself, guile heaped on guile, as in Kafka's rewrite of the Sirens. Such is the overload of mimetic delirium and metamorphic sublimity that the organization of mimesis as the basis of the domination is to wait with disorganization through the mimicry of mimicry. This then is the mastery of non-mastery, poised on the edge of understanding, an unwinding of Hegel's master-slave parable by means of a left-handed reading of that parable, such that the outcome is never secured and the dialectic never closes. It is set instead into a restless resistance staring death in the face, in which situation, as Hegel says in his famous preface to the phenomenology of spirit, miracles occur. And if not miracles, then magic. Or even licentiousness, as in Joseph Losey's 1964 film The Servant, based on a script by Harold Pinter. Here, the servant triumphs over the master, and does so in a decidedly mastery of non-mastery way. It is a triumph in which master and servant transform their relationship into one of incongruous equals in a never-ending homosexual or at least homoerotic debauchery, mocking each other and playing games like children or drunks at each other's expense. It is as if all the demons of servitude, Its guile, deceit, suffering, humiliation, and self-immolation have surfaced and exploded in hallucinatory play. If anything, the servant has the edge in these games, but both ex-master and ex-servant seem to fall head over heels in love with each other and with the theater they jointly create of their newfound utopia. Actually, they seem most in love with the game, with its seesawing changes of scene and power positions, rather than with any outcome. It is funny and erotic. Everything Hegel is not. It is also scary. The theater they construct and keep on constructing seems as if it will wind on forever, just as the mastery of non-mastery keeps unwinding the many layers of paradox by which it is constituted and by which it is energized, hence the sex and play. I keep wondering what would happen, however, if a visitor arrived. Would the servant resume the servant position as camouflage? Like the dissimulating slaves in Melville's story of slavery in Mimesis called Benito Sereno, in which the cargo of African slaves who have taken command of the ship act as if they are slaves when another ship approaches. As I recall, Melville brings his talent to bear on the uncanny atmosphere felt by a white visitor to the ship who senses something amiss but cannot figure out what it is. This is the theater of dissimulation played for high stakes indeed. What both Benito Sereno and the servant bring out is not merely the theatrical element of power, which Brecht's poem Who Rules in the Third Reich alerts us to so well, but the skilled revelation of skilled concealment that seems as inseparable from mastery as its confrontation.